Hi, my name is Steve Myers. I'd like to start this presentation by sharing a music video. It's full of symbolism, so can I suggest that you make a note of anything within it that strikes you as poignant or meaningful? There will be opportunity to discuss the meaning of the video and its relevance to analytical psychology at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to share that now. We'll come back to that video later. The historian E.H. Carr once compared doing history to going fishing. What you find depends on who's doing the fishing, where they go, what equipment and techniques they use, and so on. So history can be quite a fluid thing if different people investigate it. A similar principle applies to reading Jung's work. What we find in it depends on our starting point, what we are looking for, the theories we use, the context from which we read, and so on. C.G. Jung was unhappy with how most people read psychological types because what they found in it was not what he intended them to find. In this presentation, I'm going to draw some distinctions between normality as viewed by Myers-Briggs typology and as viewed by Jung. Just to set the context, normality can be defined in lots of different ways, and it is also a controversial subject. In the area of depth psychology, Freud defined normality according to the internal state of the psyche. To be normal is to be free from neuroses. However, we've all got complexes and neuroses, even if we don't realize it. So for Freud, normality is an ideal fiction. Having said that, since Freud's day, there has been a lot of work in the field of psychoanalysis that takes the concept of normality in several different directions. For example, Maxwell Gitelson saw normality as being free from disease, and a disease might be living behind a facade. Anna Freud saw it as following a typical development path. Ernest Jones saw it as being able to endure difficult times. And Edward Glover saw it as a social standard of adaptation. This last definition was the focus of Michel Foucault's criticism of the use of the concept of normality. He accused psychiatrists and psychologists of disciplining and punishing people who transgressed social norms. For example, it is not that long ago when women were put into psychiatric hospitals for having a child out of wedlock. Foucault included Freud in his criticism, but he was wrong to do so. Foucault was so caught up with the idea of social transgression that he read it into Freud. He failed to understand that Freud's concept was about the internal state of the psyche. If you want more detail on the relation of Freud, Foucault, and Jung, I have an academic paper that you can access via the short link myers.co/normality. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the difference between Isabel Briggs Myers and C.G. Jung's views of normality. In the foreword to Gifts Differing, Peter Briggs Myers highlights that Jung was a clinician, and he claims that Jung was not interested in normal psychology. But that isn't actually the case. We can see Jung's interest in normality in the various subjects he wrote about: politics, religion, culture, marriage, family, relationships, the humanities, science, and so on. In Jung's foreword to Psychological Types, he says his book is aimed at a normal audience. Jung hoped that psychological types would be the main way in which analytical psychology would be introduced to what he called the educated lay mind. But Jung's book is difficult to read for all sorts of reasons. For example, he makes assumptions about what the reader knows. He weaves his main ideas into a literature review, and his writing style is rather opaque. The result is that in several ways, Myers-Briggs theory and Jungian theory have developed in different directions, including in their understanding of what is normal. One key difference is the number of groups for each preference. In Myers-Briggs typology, it is normal to be either an extrovert or an introvert. So there are only two groups. But for Jung, there are three, and in his understanding, it is normal to not be a type. This quote is from a 1923 lecture, which was written up in a paper that Jung gave to Catherine Cook-Briggs in 1937. Jung clarified that there is a third group, and he said, this group is the most numerous and includes the less differentiated normal man. The normal man is, by definition, influenced as much from within as from without. I call the first group extroverted and the second group introverted. The red and blue groups on the outside are the psychological types. The purple group in the middle are the ones that he calls normal. The problem today is that this middle group doesn't get studied. In Myers-Briggs research, we create a dividing line down the middle and push half the purple group people into the red group and the other half into the blue group. But I think there could be a lot going on in this middle group. In my book, I outline Jung's 4 stages of individuation using the axiom of Maria, which is the metaphor Jung used in later years. In short, stage 1 is unconsciousness. Stage 2 is the development of a one-sided attitude, which is when we become a type. Stage 3 involves the withdrawal of projections, the recognition and valuing of the opposite within us, and holding the opposites in tension. And stage 4 is the emergence of the transcendent function from between the opposites. In that process, stages 1, 3, and 4 are all in this middle group. It is only when we are at stage 2 that we move into one of the outer red or blue groups. In fact, even at stage 2, we might still be in the middle. Let me give you an example of this. Jung wrote about this in his 2 essays, but Marie-Louise von Franz was asked about it after one of her lectures on typology. Is there a situation where functions do not differentiate one-sidedly? Von Franz replied, yes. For instance, farmers would not survive unless they used all their functions, more or less. He cannot only be an intuitive. He simply has to use his sensation. Otherwise, he would be ruined at once. So in natural situations, things are more or less arranged so that one must, to a certain extent, use all the functions. That is why people who live under natural conditions rarely become as one-sided as town dwellers. This is the old, well-known problem of specialization. What von Franz is suggesting is that the development of consciousness in stage 2 of the axiom of Maria doesn't have to be one-sided. In chapter 2 of Psychological Types, Jung says it is often one-sided because in modern society we have to specialize. But when we take a historical perspective on an evolutionary timescale, there is something unnatural or abnormal about the way we live our lives. In the middle group, which Jung called the normal group, there can therefore be people who are at any of the 4 stages of individuation. But we're not going to know for certain unless we research that middle group. And we're not going to research them so long as we divide everyone into 2 groups based on a snapshot of where they are at a particular point in time. Even if we focus on just stage 2 and turn our attention to the 2 outside groups, Myers-Briggs and Jungian theory have different views on what is normal at that stage. A key one is the normal orientation of the auxiliary function. As John Beebe says, Isabel Briggs-Myers pointed out that one's auxiliary function is, Jung says, in one place, in every respect different from the nature of the primary function. All Jung meant by in every respect different was that the auxiliary function was different in one respect. Beebe explains that for Jung, if the dominant is rational, then the auxiliary is irrational and vice versa. But rational and irrational are so radically different that they are in effect different in every respect. Jung did not intend to suggest that the auxiliary was oriented in the opposite direction. This is because Jung looked at the orientation of consciousness as a whole, not the functions individually. So for Jung, conscious functions would all be oriented in the same direction. We can see Jung expressing this view in a lecture on typology in 1928, when he said, "One cannot be introverted or extroverted without being so in every respect. For example, to be introverted means that everything in the psyche happens as it must happen according to the law of the introvert's nature. Introversion or extroversion, as a typical attitude, conditions the whole psychic process." Another example is the lecture in 1923, where Jung says, "The undeveloped functions possess the peculiarity that when the conscious attitude is introverted, they are extroverted and vice versa." So Jung only talks about the orientation of conscious or unconscious functions as a group, and not the orientation of individual functions. This is important because it underpins Jung's theory of unconscious compensation, which, for Jung at least, is a key issue in normal psychology. If we use a sailing analogy, consciousness is akin to the wind above the water that pushes the boat in a certain direction. Unconscious compensation is like the underwater keel that provides a balancing force to the wind above and stops the boat from tipping over. In Jung's model, functions that are differentiated into consciousness are oriented in the same direction. For example, let's suppose left represents introversion and right represents extroversion. And let's suppose sensation has been differentiated as a dominant function in an introverted direction. If the individual then develops thinking as the auxiliary, then, in Jung's view, thinking would also be introverted. The functions of feeling and intuition in the unconscious would then be oriented in the opposite direction to provide unconscious compensation to the conscious attitude. In Gifts Differing, Isabel Briggs Myers acknowledges the widespread assumption among Jungian analysts that the dominant and auxiliary are naturally both extroverted or both introverted. But she says that is not the norm. What is normal in the Myers-Briggs model is for the two conscious functions to be differentiated in opposite directions. When we look at the two outer groups who are at stage 2 of individuation, there are therefore two different models for what is normal. The Jungian model orients the two most differentiated functions in the same direction, and the Myers-Briggs model orients them in opposite directions. The question is, which model is right? What goes on in the normal population? In 2001, I collected some data using a version of my questionnaire that measures each of the 8 function attitudes independently. I then did some pattern matching and a cluster analysis, and they both came out with similar results. There were 3 main patterns or clusters that emerged. In this data set of just over 800 people, 26% of people fitted Isabel Briggs Myers' model. That is, the dominant and auxiliary were oriented in opposite directions. 29% of cases fitted Jung's model. That is, the dominant and auxiliary were oriented in the same direction. For comparison, a random score would be 14%. 45% of cases didn't fit either pattern, and they could be broken down into various smaller groups or clusters. That 45% could be Jung's middle group, and those smaller groups could be at different stages of Jung's process of individuation. However, I don't think Jung would have been particularly interested in these numbers. In 1948, he called for more research into normal psychology. He wasn't interested in the detail of how typological functions are oriented or differentiated. What he was most interested in was the relationship of consciousness and the unconscious, and how the unconscious compensation of lots of individuals aggregates together to have a societal or cultural impact. To illustrate this, I want to show another video about how the unconscious of lots of people can aggregate to have a collective impact. Again, we won't discuss this immediately, but we can discuss it at the end. So please make any notes of things you might want to come back to. Let me ask a rhetorical question. Is it the case that before the pandemic, we were living in normality and COVID has brought us 2 years of abnormality? Or is it the case that before the pandemic, we were insulated from the consequences of our one-sidedness, and the pandemic has given us a glimpse of what the unconscious impact of our lifestyles can be? And let me ask another rhetorical question that isn't entirely unrelated. Is it normal to be a type and to live out that type as well as we can? Or is being a type a problem and one that we need to solve? Isabel Briggs Myers and C.G. Jung both recognized there was a problem, but the problem they saw was different, so they came up with different answers. For Isabel Briggs Myers, the problem was an imbalance in consciousness between extroversion and introversion, and between judgment and perception. So her solution was to develop an auxiliary function. And if we can stay true to our dominant auxiliary combination, or be psychologically patriotic, as she put it, then it means we are well adjusted. Normality, in Myers-Briggs theory, is being a good stage 2 type. For Jung, the problem was much wider. It was the split in the psyche between consciousness and the unconscious that occurs at stage 2. Because being a type, even with a well-developed auxiliary function, is still being one-sided. Jung therefore takes a different view of normality. By normal, I mean a person who can somehow exist under all circumstances which afford him the minimum needs of life. Before I continue, this is advocating quite a religious attitude. Think of Buddhism, where desire creates much of our suffering. The antidote to suffering is to let go of our desires. Or think of the Apostle Paul when he writes to the Philippians and says he has learned how to live in all circumstances. Jung continues, many people cannot do this. By far, the greater number of more or less differentiated persons demand conditions of life which offer considerably more than the certainty of food and sleep. For these, the ending of a symbiotic relationship comes as a severe shock. When we are a type, we demand certain conditions in our working or social life. This creates a symbiosis between our personalities and the environment. But if the environment changes, it can cause a symbiotic shock. Jung gives an example of this in the experience of a client who was an American businessman. He had a wonderfully full life, working, riding horses, playing golf, parties, and so on. But when he retired, he had a nervous collapse. He was well adjusted to his working life, but in doing so, he had become one-sided. He had constructed a lifestyle that met the demands or desires of his personality. But when his lifestyle changed, he was unable to adapt to the new circumstances of his retirement. This isn't adaptation in the sense of having a perceptive preference. Living a perceptive lifestyle is itself a form of adjustment. Adaptation is a much deeper principle. Jung talks about this difference between adjustment and adaptation in psychological types in his discussion of extroversion. In the eyes of an extrovert, adjustment must seem like complete adaptation. But adjustment is not adaptation. Adaptation requires far more than merely going along smoothly with the conditions of the moment. It requires observance of laws more universal than the immediate conditions of time and place. So Jung is pointing here to a form of adaptation that is deeper than type and to a deeper law. The Jungian analyst Joseph Wheelwright also points to that deeper law when he says the most important thing about types is de-typing. When we become a type, we identify with one set of preferences, with one side of the opposites. As a result, we make demands of our lifestyle so that we have a symbiosis between our preferences and the world around us. We seek a good adjustment between our typology and our external life. But for Jung, this period of adjustment is only a staging post, stage 2, in the process of individuation. Adaptation involves going through all 4 stages of individuation, culminating in the development of the transcendent function. And this isn't just typological adaptation. It also includes things like political, religious, and cultural adaptation. And going beyond type not only leads to better adaptation, but it also helps us to become individuals. As Jung explains in chapter 2 of Psychological Types, typology is a collective psychology that damages our individuality. He writes, "The privileged position of the superior function is as detrimental to the individual as it is valuable to society. Should he excel, he is merely identical with his collective function. There is a deep gulf between what he is as an individual and what he is as a collective being. His function is developed at the expense of his individuality. Our individuality comes in stages 3 and 4 of individuation. It comes from between the opposites, not by identifying with one or the other. This is the main argument of chapter 5 of Psychological Types. Though Jung puts it more succinctly in his book, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. It is the old game of hammer and anvil. Between them, the patient iron is forged into an indestructible whole, an individual. This roughly is what I mean by the individuation process. The hammer and the anvil are the opposites. They are extroversion and introversion, or sensation and intuition, or thinking and feeling, or Labour and Conservative, or Democrat and Republican, or Christian and atheist, and so on. There are many opposites that we can encounter in life, and our individuality emerges not from identifying with one side or the other, but from allowing ourselves to experience the conflict between the opposites. It may seem that typology describes your individuality, but it doesn't. It describes a collective psychology, one that you share with a few 100 million other people in the world. Typology is associated with your persona, which Jung defines as a portion of the collective psyche. In his 2 essays, Jung writes, "The persona is a mask of the collective psyche, a mask that feigns individuality. The persona is always identical with a typical attitude, in other words, with a type, that is dominated by a single psychological function, for example, by thinking, feeling, or intuition. So our persona and our typology that is identical with that persona can give the impression of being individual, but it is at bottom collective. It serves a collective need. And chapter 2 of Psychological Types is about how serving that collective need develops our typology, but suppresses our genuine individuality. So how do we go beyond the collectivity of type and develop our individuality? Jung saw it primarily as a religious task, and usually in the second half of life, which he saw as the mid-30s onwards. One way he described it was using the symbol of rain, which I'll expand on shortly. But first, I want to play another video that is a medley of songs that suggest various meanings for the symbol of rain. We'll have a chance to talk about this at the end as well. So again, please make notes of anything that strikes you as poignant or meaningful. I'm going to describe 4 examples that Jung used to illustrate how we can go beyond type. In most of these examples, Jung just describes going from stage 2 to stage 3 of his developmental process. This is because if we maintain the attention of opposites in stage 3, then stage 4 will naturally emerge. The first two examples are at the start of his book, Psychological Types. He opens with a discussion of Tertullian and Origen. Tertullian started out as a pagan whose type was introverted thinking. He converted to Christianity in his mid-30s and at the same time underwent a transformation of his typology. He had to forsake his intellect to acknowledge the principle of feeling. Origen was the opposite in personality terms. His father was a Christian martyr. Origen's type originally was extroverted feeling. He allegedly made himself a eunuch. This also involved a transformation of his typology from feeling to thinking. Jung argues that they have each sacrificed their dominant function to realize the opposite side of the personality. In the axiom of Maria, this is one way we might go from stage 2 to stage 3. Jung anticipates a potential counter-argument that Tertullian and Origen are examples of type falsification. That is, their types didn't really change, but they just discovered what their original types were. Jung counters this by writing, in the Christian process, the original type has actually become reversed. This is not because Tertullian had always been the man of feeling and Origen the intellectual. Their whole nature was so sincere that their conversion had both reality and truthfulness. So these transformations came about through religious experiences. The third example is that of Faust. Jung often referred to Goethe's version of the story, and he uses it as an example in Psychological Types. The play opens with Faust at stage 2 of development, when Faust is a thinking type. But then, through his encounter with Mephistopheles, Faust undergoes a transformation in which he declares feeling is all. This is the same type of switch to the opposite type that we saw in the examples of Tertullian and Origen. In the second part of Goethe's story, Faust has a messy set of adventures. He enters the realm of the mothers, which represents the depths of the psyche, and at one point Faust becomes unconscious. As he is emerging from these various stories, he then embarks on a project to reclaim land from the sea, but he drops down dead and his soul is carried to heaven. These stories represent a rather difficult time in progressing to stage 4. In fact, Jung says Faust's redemption began at his death. Psychologically, this means that the Faustian attitude, that is the one-sided attitude, must be abandoned before the individual can become an integrated whole. The fourth example I want to mention is Jung himself and a fantasy that he had in December 1913 about killing Siegfried. Siegfried is a hero in German legend who kills a dragon. Later, as Jung describes, Siegfried and Baldur, he was also a hero and a god, were both murdered by a perfidious traitor from among their closest associates. In December 1913, Jung had a dream. Siegfried appeared and we shot at him, and he plunged down, struck dead. A tremendous downfall of rain began. Jung explained the meaning of this dream in the 1925 seminars. It was a case of destroying the hero. This has to be sacrificed in order that a new adaptation can be made. The sacrifice of the superior function gets at the libido necessary to activate the inferior functions. Marie-Louise von Franz notes the significance of the heroic Siegfried to Jung in her introduction to the Zofingia lectures. These were lectures that Jung gave to a student society when he was still a medical student in his early 20s. Von Franz says, it was probably the Siegfried image in Jung's psyche that Freud sensed when he wanted to make him leader of the psychoanalytic movement. When Jung sacrificed Siegfried, a place of transition had been reached. That is, when Jung had the dream, he had reached an important crossroads. It required him to sacrifice the dominant function to progress to the next stage in the process of individuation. This is stage 3, and it involves realizing the inferior function. This is much more than bringing the inferior function into the service of the dominant function, which only lets out of the inferior function those bits that are acceptable or palatable. Jung's theory is about transformation and becoming, and to become something new, we have to let go of what we had before. Jung's dream of Siegfried was part of a deliberate letting go on his part. In 1913, he had begun his confrontation with the unconscious, from which emerged many of the main ideas in analytical psychology. But he came to realize that what he was experiencing wasn't something unnatural or rare. It was a part of normality. The transcendent function is, in the first place, a natural process, which may in some cases pursue its course without the knowledge or the assistance of the individual, and can sometimes forcibly accomplish itself in the face of opposition. The meaning and purpose is the realization of the personality. I have termed this the individuation process. In her lectures on typology, von Franz gives an example of how this might happen naturally in the normal population. The superior function degenerates like an old car, such as a thinking type who can't think any longer, or a feeling type who doesn't show any agreeable feeling anymore. In the realm of the inferior function, one is overwhelmed. When the fourth function comes up, the whole upper structure, that is the whole conscious structure of dominant, auxiliary, etc., collapses, which produces a state where everything is neither thinking, nor feeling, nor sensation, nor intuition. Something new comes up, namely a completely different and new attitude toward life, in which one uses all and none of the functions all the time. In Jung's dream of killing Siegfried, the rain stands for the emergence of the transcendent function. The rain that fell is a symbol of the release of tension, that is, the forces of the unconscious are loosed. As soon as the main function is deposed, there is a chance for other sides of the personality to be born into life. So becoming one-sided or a type is a normal and natural development in life. But as with Anna Freud's view of normality, it is normal when it is part of a process. It represents stage 2. To reach individuation stages 3 and 4, we have to abandon the superior function or abandon its superiority and move on to the stage where the rain falls. As Jung puts it in the Red Book, let it rain. Let each thing have its development. Let becoming have its day. I'll finish with one more video. This one is more religious than the earlier ones. After it is finished, we can discuss any points or questions that you wish to raise. So thank you for listening.